Welcome ladies and gentlemen, it's Iceblade here with another YouTube video. Today we're doing yeast starter. Now this continues from the topic I did yesterday on yeast, or more baking yeast actually. And it was, like mentioned in that video, it was a challenge at first because the yeast we're going to do the starter with here is a yeast that expired, or it passed its sell-by date by 4 years. So we're going to see if we can get that zombie going again, or get it back from the dead. Now the main purpose of a yeast starter is health. Healthy yeast. Then basically more yeast, like cell count, increasing the cell count, increasing your colony. But first of all, it should be healthy yeast. So in any process in brewing, everybody that has done some brewing before knows sanitize. Everything needs to be clean to create a healthy yeast starter. Now, the basics of a yeast starter is just, it's a micro small brew that you actually do, because it's the same. Like the basics in brewing is water, sugar and yeast. With your starter, it's the same. There would be water, there would be a form of sugar, and then it would be the yeast in the right temperature, and then that would start off your yeast to grow. Now, when is it absolutely necessary to do a yeast starter? Like in the challenge we're doing now, the first would be to proof a yeast, to see if the yeast is alive or it's active, or you're dealing with a dead yeast. Now, normally people would pitch that sachet in a brew and then later see that it's not actually active, nothing's happening, the airlock is not bubbling, and then go to the forums and like, nothing is happening to my brew. What's wrong? Is the yeast dead? Should I pitch another yeast? Now, if you did a yeast starter, if the yeast was in fact dead, then nothing would happen in your starter, and then you would not pitch that starter because you could physically see it's dead. Then you would make another starter, and if that was going well, whatever, you would pitch it. If it wasn't, you would do the process again. So it's actually to prove that there is healthy yeast, so that you pitch healthy yeast in your brew. Now, secondly, it's normally people that's using liquid yeast, that is good yeast, but in high gravity beers, you would pitch 2 vials or 2 packets of that liquid yeast to get the right quantity of healthy yeast cells in your brew. Now, with a yeast starter, health, like I said, was first, but the cell count comes with it. So you actually start a small colony in your starter. It increases. So when you pitch that one liquid yeast that you made a starter of, it would actually be sufficient, and you didn't need to do the second yeast, either pack, smack pack, or vial. So you can actually take that one liquid yeast container, do it in a starter, let it be healthy, multiply, and then you end up with more yeast that you can basically pitch in your brew. So other than the necessity when to do the yeast starter, what would you get out of a yeast starter? Because for me, I basically yeast start everything. Dry yeast, liquid yeast, any brew I make, I do a yeast starter. Because I never asked that question, did I pitch dead yeast? No, I would see that in my starter. So I starter everything. All my yeast goes through this process, and the advantages that I've seen currently is you get healthy yeast, like I've mentioned a couple of times now. You do get an increased cell count in your yeast. Now that is great. You're not over pitching your yeast, but you're introducing more yeast into your brew. Now, yeast that if you pitch too less, yeast goes through a stress process, and during that stress process, to handle this wort, or even if you're introducing not enough yeast in a high gravity beer, they go through that stress process, and then they actually, one of their byproducts will be like a off flavor, or it's not what you want in your beer actually. So you're stressing this yeast, and the byproduct would not be favorable for your end result of the beer you're making. So you're avoiding that. You're getting a more consistent brew because you're adding enough yeast. It's hard. People have mentioned the word overpitching. It's hard to actually overpitch. You can overpitch. By all means, you can overpitch. But it's hard for a home brewer to overpitch. You really need to go flat out. I've seen breweries mention that they actually overpitch to get the fermentation going faster and to get the fermentation finishing faster, because it's quantity for them. And it's not that they lose any quality as such, but they need to get beers out, and beers out fast. For a home brewer or craft brewer, whatever we are, we're fine with waiting the time, so we don't overpitch to get the beer done faster. Because if you really do the overpitch thing, that is also negative in the fact that you would also get some off flavors, because you're not allowing the yeast to go through its full process that you need it to do. You're rushing it. You're introducing more workers to do work, and people's going to get bumpy, and stuff is not going to be happy inside your brew. So, but to not get too far off the point, you won't overpitch actually when you're a home brewer. You really need to want to overpitch and add more yeast and more yeast and more yeast to reach that. These microbreweries that I spoke to said, well, you basically need to pitch 10 times to actually go over pitching to the over pitching side. So if you pitch like 2 times the amount, it still won't be considered over pitching. So you don't have to worry about that. So the yeast that you create in your starter is not going to be over pitched because now it's increasing and it's going to be bigger. It's going to be a healthy family. Remember, I always say healthy because this is starter. You're doing a yeast starter first for health. So you're going to get healthy yeast that you pitch inside your brew. Healthy yeast is happy yeast. Does a good job inside your brew. So if we look at what a yeast starter is, like I said, it's just a small brew you're making, actually a very small micro one. Actually, everybody has made a starter, because you made wort and you added yeast to it. That would be a starter, just in a bigger scale. So I'm just doing it in a smaller scale. So it's not that much of an effort. Normally the pros doing the brewing would take some of their wort and use that prior to brew day for creating their starter. So that would bring me to the point, how do you actually make the starter? Now, I have been taught there's 4 ways, or there might be more, but the basics that they say to me is it's like brewing, and the basics of brewing is water, sugars, and yeast. So that's the same in a starter. So the basic starter would be water and then sugar in the form of normal house sugar or brewing sugar, dextrose, or any sugar you have that's fermentable, and then adding your yeast at the right temperature, and there's your basic, that is rock bottom basic starter. The improved version was the same: water, fermentable sugars, and then your yeast, but you would add yeast nutrient to increase the success rate of your starter. Now, I use DAP, diammonium phosphate, for my nutrient. The right method, I would say, it's not a wrong or a right method, but the method I use, and the method I'm going to use on camera now, is the one where you use water, and for the sugars we're going to use DME. Now, DME is just short for a dried malt extract. Now, I found that the lighter the DME is, the better it is for yeast. So I have a light to medium DME that I always just keep for the purpose of making starters. DME is not expensive and it will last you a long time. The formula that I've been taught is it's 1 gram of DME for 10 milliliters of liquid, your water basically. So it really is not that much. It's a small, like I said, it's a micro one. It's a small brew you're actually making just for the yeast starter. So you're brewing in a flask and then adding that brew to your other brew, but then you have a healthy brew that's basically a yeast that you putting into it. Now the last one, because we did the basic water, sugar and yeast, water, sugar and yeast, a nutrient, DME and water and the yeast, and the last one, like I already actually mentioned it, is the pro version where you use some of your wort to actually grow your yeast starter in. Now that is actually the preferred one by all the good brewers out there, because they say you're already introducing your yeast into the environment that they are going to actually end up working in. So they get used to that wort and then they multiply and become lovely healthy yeast in that, and then you introduce them into a bigger of the same that they're already used to. No shock there, nothing funny for them, and they just continue and they increase in cell count, and you have a good brew after that. Okay, so just again, the formula would be 1 gram to 10 milliliters of water. That is the formula, but how much starter do I need? Now, the way I've been taught is normally 1.5 liters to a 23 to 25 liter batch you're doing. In smaller batches like 1 gallon, like those 5 liter batches or 10 liter batches, you would go 1 liter or less. For me, what I normally do is, if I'm doing a small batch, I would do 1.2 liters, because you're going to go with the DME method, you're going to boil it. So there is going to be loss through evaporation, but you'll end up with a liter of yeast starter. Now, if it's a small batch, like you're doing a yeast starter of a liter now, and you're doing a 5 liter batch, say that is a small batch, and now you're going to add another liter. You don't have to add the full amount of liquid in your yeast starter. You can actually just add the yeast, because they will settle at the bottom. So you can then remove the rest of the DME. Don't throw it away. You can still use it. It's still usable. But then you can just pitch the yeast if you're doing a small batch. Now, if you're doing a big batch and you're going to do a 1.5 liter yeast starter, you just chuck that whole thing into your brew. You're going to lose in anyway. Everybody that has brewed before know that there is loss. So that wouldn't make a difference. Your buckets normally, or your fermenting vessel, if you're doing 25 liter batches, can take a bit more. There is headroom for it. So formula: 1 gram, 10 milliliters of water. I would say 1.5 liter starter for a 20 to 25 liter batch, and then below that for the 10 liter batches or the 5 liter batches, you can, if you think about it mathematically, you would go to 10, say a liter, and then for the 5 you would do a 500 ml. But for me, I do it in a liter, even though I do the 5 liter batch, and then I just pour off the excess liquid and then just introduce the healthy yeast to my brew. So it's still up to you. Like, you could chuck the DME on the top, because that is not yeast, that is just the environment that they were in. Or you can introduce the whole thing into your brew. It's not going to make a difference. It's just quantity. And if I'm doing a 5 liter batch, I'm normally doing it in one of these 1 gallon jars. So there's not a lot of headroom depending on what your boil off is when you're doing full grain. So after this video, I'm also going to do one where I do a full grain just for the yeast that we're now testing in this challenge to see if we can get our zombie yeast back to life, and then doing a full grain brew. And if it is alive in our starter, then I'm going to pitch it and have joy, I believe. If I can't get this yeast back to life, I am going to use a different, I have a lot of yeast, so I'm going to use a proper yeast that has not expired yet. So let's hold thumbs.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So I just popped in onto the desktop, like you can see. Well, basically why I came here is I was editing the video that you're watching, and I noticed that the amount of information and video I still have left will actually make this a very long video. So I decided to split it into two and make the first part that you now basically watched the information about this process, and then make it a two-part video, and the second part would be the work. So we would call it, the first part was the educational part, and then the second part would be the practical part of things. So I hope that you found this helpful so far. If you did, please subscribe so we can get this channel flying in the right direction, and also hit like if you found any of the information I gave helpful. If you didn't, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments down below. I try to answer every comment there is, and you can just like leave a comment there and what the issue is, or a problem you have, or a worry you have about taking on this process, and I would get back to you and try to assist you as best I can in writing. So thanks for watching, guys.